CollectA have announced that they'll be adding a 1:20 scale replica of the armoured dinosaur Polacanthus foxii to their CollectA Deluxe model range. It's going to be in stock at Everything Dinosaur later this year. But just how scientifically accurate is this dinosaur model? We've taken a look at the fossil material associated with this taxon, and we've seen how Polacanthus has been reconstructed in the past. We've been on a remarkable journey. Stick around, we'll tell you more. Hi, Everything Dinosaur here, and in today's video we'll be taking a look at the soon to be available CollectA Deluxe Polacanthus foxii figure in 1:20 scale. This is one of the pre-production prototypes. It's an astonishing model that shows some incredible detail. Features and characteristics on this figure which we don't think have been seen in other Polacanthus models. But just how closely does this figure reflect the fossil material associated with this taxon? Let's explore Polacanthus, perhaps one of the most misunderstood of all the Dinosauria. So, after the obligatory reminder about subscribing, we'll crack on. Don't forget to subscribe and to hit that notification button to be part of the conversation. Named in 1865 in somewhat controversial circumstances, Polacanthus foxii was one of the first armoured dinosaurs to be described. Only a few armoured dinosaurs, such as Hylaeosaurus, Scelidosaurus, and the dubious genus Palaeontologists, have been named previously. Although a considerable amount of armoured dinosaur fossil material associated with the Wealden Group has been assigned to Polacanthus, it is very unlikely that this material represents a single taxon. For example, in 2023, a new species of armoured dinosaur, Vectipelta barretti, was named. It was described from fossil material discovered close to the plant debris beds on the south coast of the Isle of Wight, from which the Polacanthus holotype was probably excavated. Although these fossil sites are just a couple of miles apart, the rocks associated with Vectipelta fossils are at least 6 million years older than the plant debris bed associated with Polacanthus. Phylogenetic assessment suggests that Vectipelta is not closely related to the Polacanthus genus. We can expect more armoured dinosaur taxa to be announced as Wealden Group material is further revised. This means that the amount of fossil material assigned to Polacanthus foxii has been substantially reduced, and now it is only the holotype, a fragmentary skeleton representing the rear end of the animal, and other scrappy fossils such as those found in the Compton Bay area of the Isle of Wight that tend to be associated with this species. This dinosaur was redescribed in 1887, following extensive repairs and restoration of the dermal armour. It was in 1905 that the first reconstruction of Polacanthus foxii was attempted. The polymath Baron Franz Nopcsa was employed to mount the holotype fossil material, the property of the British Museum of Natural History, now known as the London Natural History Museum, and to oversee the skeleton going on public display. Nopcsa was a genius, but he had very little material to work with. In 1905, the Ankylosauria was virtually unknown. It's worth remembering that very famous armoured dinosaurs, such as Ankylosaurus magniventris and Euoplocephalus tutus, were not described until 1908 and 1910 respectively. Baron Nopcsa based his reconstruction of Polacanthus foxii on one taxon of armoured dinosaur that was quite well known, a dinosaur from the Morrison Formation of the western United States, Stegosaurus. You can see the influence of Stegosaurus in the Nopcsa reconstruction. No skull material was known, so Polacanthus was reconstructed with the typical small, narrow skull of Stegosaurus. The highly fragmentary dermal armour was mounted using the plates of Stegosaurus as a guide, which is perhaps why you have the double row of spikes dorsally orientated, pointing upwards and running along the back of the animal, just as seen in Stegosaurus, even though the spikes, spines and bosses associated with Polacanthus are shaped very differently. Nopcsa's restoration coloured our perception of Polacanthus foxii. Its influence can be seen in virtually every illustration and reconstruction of this dinosaur over the last 100 years or so. We now know much more about the Ankylosauria, the Nodosaurids, and specifically the Polacanthinae subfamily. We're also seeing an ongoing revision of the armoured dinosaur material associated with the Wealden Group. The CollectA Deluxe Polacanthus model provides a much more modern interpretation, one that generally reflects the fossil material still associated with this species. Having looked at how Polacanthus has been depicted historically, let's take a closer look at the CollectA Deluxe figure. So this is the prototype figure of the CollectA Deluxe 1:20 scale Polacanthus foxii model. And let's take a closer look at this figure, starting with the head. Now, it doesn't have the head of a Stegosaurus, and it doesn't have the broad muzzle that you might associate with the Ankylosauria, animals such as the late Cretaceous Ankylosaurus, magniventris for example. It's got a broad skull, but then a narrow muzzle, very reminiscent of the likes of Gastonia and other Nodosaurids. Now, if we look at the neck, it's got two rows of cervical armour. These are the half rings of armour associated with Polacanthus and other Nodosaurids, as well as members of the Ankylosauria, which are more derived. Now, in later ankylosaurs, the half rings of armour were fused, but in Polacanthus foxii, the armour associated with the cervical vertebra is not fused, and therefore reconstructing it is much more difficult. Now, there's enough fossil material in the Polacanthus foxii holotype and the scrappy fossils which are still associated with this species to indicate that it had at least two half rings of cervical armour. Now, many Nodosaurids had three, but since Polacanthus has enough fossil material to give it two rings of cervical armour, that's exactly what the Polacanthus figure from CollectA shows. Two areas of armour associated with the neck. The CollectA Deluxe Polacanthus in 1:20 scale has a pair of spikes located on the upper arm, just in association with the large splate, that plate with a spike on it, hence the word splate, which is over the shoulder. Now, there has been some unusual spikes and spines found in stratum close to where it is believed the Polacanthus holotype fossil material was found. And these spines have an unusual morphology. The larger spine has got a groove in its posterior edge, and the smaller spine has like a ridge on its front edge, which indicates that these two spines are butted up against each other. They would have moved as one. Now, it suggests that this dinosaur had some form of armour protecting its forearm. And if you think about a Polacanthus, if all its armour is on the top side of its body, then having something to protect it from being flipped, to protect its upper arm, makes sense. So it looks like there was some form of spine or spike associated with the humerus, the upper arm. Now, wouldn't it be great if we could actually see a living Polacanthus to determine where this dermal armour was placed? Well, we can't do that, but ironically there is a fossil specimen, a member of the Ankylosauridae, which has got these two spines in their situation as if the animal was still alive, in situ. And that's a specimen of the armoured dinosaur called Stegosaurus cutleri, a dinosaur from North America, which was ironically named and described by Baron Franz Nopcsa, the person who's responsible for originally erecting a reconstruction of Polacanthus. So, the CollectA Deluxe 1:20 scale Polacanthus has dermal armour that isn't seen, as far as we're aware, on any other Polacanthus figure. But if you look at the area between the neck and that famous Sacral Shield, it seems to be missing something. There are no spines. No spines sticking up, running along the back of the model. What are termed pre-sacral spines. That's because the latest fossil interpretation indicates that this animal may not have had dorsally orientated spines. That's Stegosaurus Influence once again. Dr. William Blows, a world-renowned expert on the Polacanthinae, has suggested that the spikes were probably orientated laterally, sticking out from the flanks of this animal. In his book on Polacanthus Dinosaurs, Dr. Blows says the following. Previously, most interpretations were that these spines pointed upwards, angled away from the midline by about 30 to 45 degrees from the upright. This was the preferred position used in Nopcsa's 1905 mount, and indeed we see it in more recent interpretations of Polacanthus too. However, the current location is to place these spines at a point more horizontally and laterally along the flanks of the trunk, closer to 90 degrees from the upright, acting as a defensive fringe. Just what we see in this CollectA reconstruction. So let's turn to that anatomical trait which is so characteristic of Polacanthus, the Sacral Shield. And the first point to make is that the ratio of length to width on this figure is about 0.84. The holotype fossil material has a sacral shield 108 centimetres wide and 90 centimetres long, with a length to width ratio also of 0.84. So congratulations to CollectA. They've got the proportion of the sacral shield in terms of width and dimensions absolutely right. And if we look at this figure and its total length, from tail to head, even though we're not really sure how big Polacanthus was, if this animal was 5 metres long, then the sacral shield at about 90 centimetres in length fits beautifully in with the length of the total model. It's a beautifully proportioned sacral shield. And the individual bosses that are associated with this sacral shield have been beautifully depicted by the CollectA design team. Now, you may have read that the sacral shield of Polacanthus had a number of rows of horizontal bosses associated with it, a total of 4. Well, if you look at the actual fossil material, there are no 4 rows present. What you do have is a large boss in the corner closest to the tail, and it is the right side of the sacral shield when you look at it in dorsal view that is best preserved. So what CollectA have done, they've carefully reconstructed the right side of the shield and then mirrored it on the left to preserve the symmetry of the dermal armour on the model. And if you look at the figure and you look at the holotype fossil material very closely, you can see just how accurately CollectA have interpreted the fossil record and represented it in this dinosaur model. Let's conclude this overview of the CollectA Deluxe Polacanthus by looking at my favourite part of the model, the tail and the dermal armour associated with it. There are 11 pairs of dermal armour, large spikes towards the rump, gradually getting smaller to the very end of the tail. Now, the dermal armour configuration on the tail of Polacanthus is simply unknown, but speculation from scientists does suggest that this figure and its configuration of dermal armour is quite an accurate reconstruction from what we know of the dermal armour preserved in association with the tail. And it's quite a beautiful reconstruction too. I love the way you have the large plates associated with the rump gradually going down to nothing more than bumps and ridges towards the very end of this dinosaur. All in all, this is a fascinating and intriguing reconstruction of Polacanthus. Again, it is very different to what I may have perceived this dinosaur to be, but I do think it reflects very closely the known fossil material. At 27 centimetres long, it might be a little bit oversized to be a 1:20 scale figure based on a dinosaur which was maybe 5 metres long. But we don't really know the length of Polacanthus foxii, so I'm going to give CollectA a little bit of leeway on that. But I do recommend that when this figure becomes available at Everything Dinosaur, you take the opportunity to pick one up, because it really is a splendid representation of what is an iconic armoured dinosaur. Well, there you have it. What I hope has been a helpful review of the science behind the new CollectA Deluxe Polacanthus figure. Now, this model will be available sometime later this year, perhaps in the early summer. We don't know quite when it will be available, but we promise to keep you posted on our social media pages. So, check out Everything Dinosaur on Facebook, on our X platform, and of course on Instagram. In addition, check out Everything Dinosaur's blog. Our weblog has thousands of articles on it, including information about armoured dinosaurs, and recently described Vectipelta barretti, another armoured dinosaur known from the Wealden Group. We'll put a link to our blog in the video description down below. In the meantime, I'll also include 2 links in the video description to the CollectA Deluxe range of prehistoric animal models and the not-to-scale CollectA Prehistoric Life range too. Please feel free to take a look at these 2 fantastic ranges of dinosaur figures, and perhaps if you want to, you can pick up a model or 2. And finally, Everything Dinosaur couldn't have made this video about Polacanthus without the help of 2 incredibly detailed dinosaur books. Firstly, there's Dinosaurs of the British Isles, written by Dr. Dean Lomax, a comprehensive overview of dinosaur fossil discoveries made in this country, the United Kingdom. And there's lots of information on Polacanthus and other armoured dinosaurs too. And secondly, there's been a wonderful book published by a gentleman called Dr. William Blowes on British Polacanthid dinosaurs. Now, don't expect to have lots of illustrations in this book showing Polacanthus fighting off carnivorous dinosaurs. It isn't that sort of book. It's a forensic analysis of the scientific material associated with the Polacanthus genus and its close relatives. It's an academic book, but it's a superb read and extremely informative. Now, those books are published by Siri Scientific Press. I will include a link to that publisher in the video description down below. I thoroughly recommend them both. So, on that note, I'll say thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video on Polacanthus. And one more thing. Thank you.